We've taken these first or second Sunday nights of the month so far this year and have been talking about women in the Bible. And sometimes the stories have been positive, sometimes they've been negative. But quite often, when it's a positive story, we can find, or excuse me, maybe it's a negative story, we can hopefully find something positive. You know, a couple months ago, we talked about Eve, and we talked about how the reality of the story at Eve is sort of devolved into just sort of a point fingers and blame kind of a thing. But there was quite a bit that could, and actually quite a few things that were beneficial because of Eve. Well, if you were paying attention to Ben just a moment ago, tonight we are going to talk about another Bible woman, but I can't give you a name. And the reason why is I don't know that there is a name. I've not seen a name, we'll put it that way. But we're going to talk tonight about Lot's wife. Okay, I'm going to remember Lot's wife here this evening. So that's our goal for us. This statement here that says remember Lot's wife can be found in Luke chapter 17. Jesus actually says it. Jesus speaks past judgments of God that he had uttered, that he had mentioned. And Jesus makes a really short statement. He said, remember Lot's wife. Sometimes it doesn't take a whole lot of words to get the point across, right? There are probably people in your life that you could erase this word Lot and put somebody else's name in. And you could say, remember so-and-so's wife, and probably a flood of memories would come back to you, right? You would probably think about maybe this is a person who lived next door, or maybe this is a person who was your school teacher, or maybe it was your aunt, or a mother or grandmother or something along those lines. But sometimes, excuse me, Josh, I'm going to blame you. Middle of March, everybody's coughing. You cannot pick these songs out that require us to ride that roller coaster all the way through right there. We got some dull dirges going forward from this point forward. But all of us could probably fill that blank in with some, and we don't have to say much, right? Well, this story of Lot would seem to have probably been pretty familiar. We'll talk a little bit more about it in the book of Hebrews as well. But to the Jewish people, really anything that's in the Old Testament, and especially anything that's in the first 5 books, would have been extremely familiar. These are stories that we still teach kids today. They were stories that would have been taught to kids back when. And so when Jesus says, remember Lot's wife, he didn't really have to say anything else. He's like, oh, yeah, I remember that. Well, I said a minute ago, we can think about that in a positive way. Can you think of anybody that you've known in your life when they might say, remember so-and-so's wife or so-and-so's husband? You're like, oh, do I ever? All right? We can think about those as well. And so what we're going to talk about here tonight is Lot's wife. This comes from Genesis chapter 19. My original thought was we could tell the whole story, but then I thought Ben would have been reading for about an hour and a half by the time we got all that done. So I thought, I just want to plug a little bit in there because I think most of us are probably familiar with it. But in Genesis chapter 19, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were doomed to destruction. And Lot and his wife were told by angels in Genesis chapter 19, verse 17, we read, so it came to pass when they had brought them outside that he said, escape for your life. Do not look behind you, nor stay anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, lest you be destroyed. Now, a little bit later there, Genesis 19, we see fire and brimstone and the city's overthrown and all of that. But what do we remember most about this story? Probably the same thing that you learned in Sunday school when you were 5 and 6 years old. We probably remember that Lot's wife did what? Look back. Now, some say turn back. She looked back. All right? There's a difference right there. But she looked back, and as the story goes, she was turned to a pillar of salt. I want to talk tonight, though, about what else do we know? Or maybe what can we learn from it? Well, to start with, the fonts that I use at home sometimes don't make it up to here. I would have never left that word man dangling like that right there. But I think I have a different program than you have here, and sometimes it looks bad. So I apologize. That looks bad to me. You may not have even noticed it. But she was married. The Bible would describe Lot as a righteous man. Now, I want you to turn New Testament to 2 Peter. Let's go to 2 Peter chapter 2, and we're going to read verses 4 through 8. Now, what do we know about Lot? Well, Lot, like any other person, made a whole lot of mistakes. But he's referred to by Peter in 2 Peter chapter 2 as a righteous man. Let's look at this for a second. This is 2 Peter 2, and we're going to read verses 4 through 8. Now, my Bible titles this Doom of False Teachers. Follow along here. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them down to hell and delivered them into chains of darkness to be reserved for judgment, and did not spare the ancient world, but saved Noah, one of 8 people, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood on the world of the ungodly, and turning the city of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemned them to destruction, making them an example to those who afterward would live ungodly, and delivered righteous Lot, who was oppressed by the filthy conduct of the wicked. For that righteous man dwelling among them tormented his righteous soul from day to day by seeing and hearing of their lawless deeds. Now, what we read here from Peter is he's just kind of giving a recap of some things that people would have been familiar with, okay? He talks about the angels in verse 4. He talks about Noah in verse 5. He talks about Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah in verse 6, but he describes in verse 7 as Lot being a righteous man. And so we don't know a ton about his wife, but we can interpret from this that she was married at least to a righteous man. Now, we all know the power of a good example, right? We're familiar with this. Paul talks about this. I've said this up here a few times in 1 Corinthians 15, but evil companions does what? I'd say all of us know that it corrupts good morals. But I think the flip side of that would be what? The more you hang around somebody who's a positive, you're probably going to be positive. The more you hang around somebody that's good morally, you're going to be good morally. And so it runs sort of both ways. Now, I can't say whether or not Lot's wife was a good person or bad person. We don't know anything about that. But we know it was extended to Lot and his family the opportunity to leave. And so we can interpret perhaps that because she was married to a righteous man, that perhaps she was as well. She went out of the city with him, right? Yes, but only so far. Now, none of us, though, is righteous enough for ourselves, right? Think about that for just a second. In Isaiah 59, the first couple of verses that we're familiar with, we know that we read there that, behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save. That's where the salvation comes from, right? But we're not righteous enough for that. The New Testament tells the same thing in Romans chapter 3 and verse 10. We read, there's none righteous, no, not one, right? And so we are aware of the fact that we are not righteous enough. And so whatever Lot was described as a righteous man, that's not righteous enough. And whatever his wife was, could be righteous, could be somewhere else on the spectrum of righteousness, wherever it is, but whatever she was, wasn't righteous enough, because there's none righteous according to Romans. Romans 3:23 through 26, a little bit later, tells us that we have to seek our redemption through who? Well, we have to seek our redemption through the New Testament, through Jesus. But that wasn't an opportunity for Lot and his wife. But their redemption had been presented in what we read there in Genesis, when they said, you need to escape. You need to leave. You need to go to the city. That opportunity was, not to the city, to the mountains. Then that opportunity was presented to them. That was what their salvation was. Now, let's go a little further. She had been warned of this danger. Think about what warnings are. Last night, Will and I were watching TV, and Mary walked through the room and she said, why is there a snow warning? And I said, well, I think it's actually for like the counties that are up on the Ohio River. But why do they put that snow warning on TV? Like they run it across the bottom, or it's like red flashing up. What's the purpose of that? They put that up there so that you can see it, right? You can't say, well, I had no idea it was going to snow. Well, you might not know, but you can see it right there. Those kind of warnings are given there. How many of you have ever been woken up in the middle of the night by some kind of warning on your phone? It starts beeping or whatever. Well, sometimes you think, I don't know why I even have this. But last year, that when the tornadoes came through this way, that thing started buzzing on my phone at about 2 o'clock in the morning or whatever time it was. I was awful glad that it did. We like a little bit of a warning of danger. She was warned of it as well. The message was pretty clear in Genesis 19, verse 17, when Lot was told to escape for your life. That's what he was told. And it doesn't say escape you only, but they all were to leave. Jesus does the same thing to us, right? He warns us of dangers that we'll face. First of all, at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, Jesus says, and I'm shortening this, that not everyone shall inherit the kingdom of heaven. That's a warning, right? I tell my kids at the start of the school year, you have to do these assignments. Not everybody will pass. They can't come to me on May the 25th and say, why didn't I pass? I show them a whole list of things and say, you didn't do this, you didn't do this, you didn't do this. And some of them will say, I did some of the assignments. Well, is that not what Jesus is saying there in Matthew chapter 7? Not everyone that saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven. But he goes on to say, but he that doeth what? The will of my Father. Well, not everyone's going to pass social studies unless you do what you got to do in the classroom. Well, the same thing is told as well. And we see a Old Testament example of somebody not following through, not doing what they were supposed to do. Matthew 25, a little bit later, we see then in Matthew 25 and 46, and these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. Well, I don't know what everlasting punishment was like for Lot's wife, but when we think about this description of a pillar of salt, that's a whole lot different than walking up into the mountains, right? So there's something different between those two things. So there was some level of punishment right there. Paul gave a similar warning. He said, well, I heard it in, we heard it in Genesis. We heard Jesus say it. Well, Paul gave something similar. In Second Thessalonians chapter 1, verses 7 and 8, Paul said, the Lord Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on those, and we read right here, who do not know God, and on those who do not obey the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so there's a requirement, there's a warning there that there would be vengeance taken upon those who do not follow. We can go a little bit further. Peter said what in Acts chapter 2 and verse 40? After he had preached, he told them to be saved from what? This perverse generation. There was a warning there saying that if you're in this group, you're not going to have the same outcome as in this group. That's why they shouted Peter down in a sense that stop preaching now. What must we do to be saved? So Lot's wife, just like us, was warned of the danger. Now, Lot's wife made an effort to be saved. I suspect most of us, when we think about the story of Lot's wife, we literally think about the story of Lot's wife, right? She turned around. That's what we said. She looked back. She turns. But for that to have happened, she had to have taken some steps away from the city. Let's think about this for a second. Perhaps the saddest part of this story is the circumstances that she was involved in. Think about it for a second. She so nearly escaped. She so nearly escaped. Most of us have probably seen stories or things from in the past where maybe a ship sank or something like that. And people, that they made it to this place or that they almost made it and then they lost. That's the worst thing, right? It's almost like I'd rather have just died right then immediately, but they were so close. Well, she nearly escapes from that. That's the first thing. Second, we see she was convinced of her need to go, right? She would have never left had she not been convinced to go, but she was convinced, but was she converted? See, the thing is, sometimes we're convinced of what we need to do, but not really full scale into that as well. She sought safety, but her interests were divided. Think about that for a second. How many of us sometimes have our interests divided? We're trying to do this, and we're trying to do that. Yesterday afternoon, Will had a football thing all day, and so I went with him to start with, and then Mary and I switched, and she came and went, and I went back home. And she told me when I left, she said, there's 3 baskets of laundry for you to do. And I was like, that's fine, because I needed. I'm going to do my church lesson like in between that dryer buzzing and all that. I'm going to work on this lesson. It'll work out good. But I got both of them done. But the whole time I was doing my lesson, I was thinking sort of in the back of my head, wonder how much time is left on the washer. And the washer has a little clock on it, and it counts down from however long it is. And there were times when I thought, oh, I'm about ready to work on it. I better stop for just a second. And I went and looked. Said, oh, it's 28 minutes. I got plenty of time to do this. Well, the point of that is my interest was divided. I was working on 2 different things at the same time. I think my lesson will be good on Wednesday night. If there's anything in there about dryer sheets, then I apologize whenever we come in here, all right? But whenever I was working on that, I'm thinking of one thing and sort of thinking of another. You can relate to this, right? Well, what about her? She knew she was supposed to leave, but do you think she was thinking about what was happening back there? There's a possibility that Lot's wife is thinking about people that she had known back there. There's a possibility that she was thinking about the home that they lived in being destroyed. It's also possible that she's a lot like us and was just kind of nosy. She wanted to see what was going on back there. A friend of mine that I graduated with, there's a house across the street from us a few years ago that burned down. Y'all may remember that. We weren't able to come to church that night because the road was sort of closed off. But after it was all over and the fire trucks was gone, I went out to take the trash out, and she and her husband drive by. And they pulled into my driveway, and she's like, I'm sorry, we're not visiting or whatever. She said, we just want to see what was happening. Well, we're kind of like that too, right? Well, it's hard for us to think about Lot's wife leaving and putting ourselves in that same spot and not thinking, well, I'd kind of want to look back and see what was going on there too. See, she had divided interests. She wanted the safety, but her interests were divided. Her body left the city, but her heart seems like it was still behind. Hebrew writer in chapter 3 told those Christians that they had left spiritual Egypt and were on their way to the promised land. We talked about stories that would have resonated with Jewish people. This is one that absolutely would have. When you're writing to the Hebrews, you're telling stories that would have made sense to them. But he said along the way in that story, he said it's possible to sit down, to rest, and while resting, die. Hebrews 4 and verse 1, therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear lest any of you seem to have come up short of it. See, what he's saying right there is it's not time to sit down and rest. Because when we sit down and rest, what do we think about? What we've just come through, right? What do? We look back. When you walk to the top of that hill and you sit down and rest, you look down the hill and think, look how far I've come, right? That's what we do. We look back. But he's saying right there, when you sit down, you may not get back up again. Do you want your last thing to be thinking down at the hill that you just climbed up, or what you still need to work on going forward? Because if we're not careful, I'm going to sit here for 5 minutes, 30 minutes later, man, I don't know if I want to get up or not. We're still looking back. She'd made an effort, but she still was not going all the way. Jesus repeatedly used these parables of judgment in his instruction. We see that quite often. And we read then it's also possible for us to neglect our own salvation, right? Now, I've wrote this up here, but I don't know that I probably should have worded this a little different. But it says she committed one sin. I don't necessarily mean that she only did one thing in her life, but the only thing we see here is this thing right here. If I were to ask you right now, think about all the sins that you could think of. Just write them all down. Well, how long would that list be? You probably have to go to the pencil sharpener somewhere in between and sharpen that pencil back up. Now, if I were to ask you, and I'm not the first person to stand in front of a group and say this, but if I were to ask you to rank them from worst to best, or however you wanted to, we'd all fall right in there, right? We know what the worst sins are. Well, think about that for a second. We hear quite often about sins of things like weakness, sins of ignorance, sins of intention. We could probably list all of those things. We say, that's a weakness one, that's an intention one, whatever it might be. But they're all sins, right? And we're all guilty. Every single person here, if we were to list all the things that you could possibly call sin, and then I were to say put a check mark besides the one that we, right? Be a whole lot of checks that we would put there. Know almost anything about Lot's wife. We know she'd been told by angels to leave, right? We know that she paused, and perhaps that was her one mistake. She was guilty, ever so briefly, of a sin of disbelief. You know what it doesn't say in the Bible? How long she looked back. It doesn't say that at all. Now, you may fill those blanks in the story. You may think that she turned and stared straight back for hours. Doesn't say. She might have even glanced like this. We fill a lot of stories in with our own intentions, what we think they were. Sometimes if we want to look back at somebody with a negative attitude, we sort of plug the negative attributes into it. We don't know how long she turned and looked back, but we know that she did. She was guilty ever so briefly, but when it was all over. It was all over. She perished not because she went back, but because she looked back. I would pause right there and say, don't say that she turned back. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible doesn't say, it says she simply looked back. Turn back to me is a movement, a effort to try. A look back is just ever so quickly. And I think the story means more if we think about it like that. Because turn back is a full turn, but a look back can happen just like that. Anybody who learns how to drive or knows how to drive, or maybe used to drive and thinks better of it now, knows that you just have to glance and you can see something. But if you don't glance just that one time, something could happen. And sometimes when you look away ever so briefly, a wreck or anything like that can happen. It doesn't take much for it. What did Jesus say in Luke chapter 9, verse 62? You'll know these words, right? Jesus said, no one having put his hand to the plow, right? Having put his hand to the plow, and then what? Looking back. He didn't say turning back. He said, having his hand to the plow and looking back is fit for the kingdom of God. What's our lesson? What do I need to know? What do we need to know from this right here? I'm going to give you two things and we're going to go home. Look forward. Don't look back. One of the things that I think we struggle with so much as Christians is when we become a Christian, we can't put the things behind us. But we've been told over and over again to leave that and move on to other things. Guys, that's exactly what Lot's wife was told as well. I don't know what they were involved in. I don't know anything about their family. But I know that Lot was described as righteous, but they lived in a world that doesn't seem like it was very righteous where they were. But the angel said for them to leave and don't look back and you'll be fine. But sometimes as Christians, we spend more time looking over our shoulder than we do looking farther ahead. And it drags down our ability. It drags down our enjoyment of Christianity. And if we're not careful, it turns us into that same pillar of salt. We're just sitting there too nervous to look forward and too worried about all the things that we look behind. Put it all behind you. Jesus said, put the hand to the plow and go forward. And I think that's the best thing that we can say as well. If there's anything we can do to help you, any way that we can help you, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.
Why keep Jesus waiting, waiting in the cold? He prepared you gently to his fold. See him so and open, open eye and close. Why keep Jesus waiting?